Inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
We are privileged to enjoy today a talk by Dick Gordon, host of the story from American Public Media for our keynote address. For the Puzzle Symposium, the university scholars proposed a number of ideas for keynote speakers. The speakers then voted on nominees and chose Dick Gordon. And cribbing his bio from the story's website, Mr. Gordon is the former host of The Connection at WBUR in Boston, and is now hosting the story at WUSC right here in North Carolina. Mr. Gordon is well known in the profession as an experienced seasoned journalist with an extensive background in both international and domestic reporting. He was a war correspondent and backup host for the CBC's This Morning and National Current Affairs radio program. An award-winning journalist, he's also served as parliamentary reporter, Moscow correspondent, and South Asia correspondent, both radio and television. Given his own rich life experience and his talent at researching and weaving together complicated narratives to craft a coherent and compelling story in his radio work, the students felt that he would be ideally suited to speak about people as puzzles. Mr. Gordon will share with us today his insights on how we solve puzzles in everyday life, from making decisions based on emotion, reason, economics, or ethics as we confront circumstances that we encounter daily, as well as the increasing pressures we feel to make our decisions ever more quickly. So please join me now in welcoming Dick Gordon.
Can you hear me back there? Can you hear me okay? I'm not good at projecting, so there's chairs up front. If I start to get a little quiet, please feel free to move forward. Thank you, Tori and Chris, for your help setting up today. My neighbor, Meg Shea, for being part of the invitation group. Also wins herself a slight task today. I need your help, Meg, if you just sort of come up here to begin. I wonder if you could just make sure that everybody gets a marshmallow. Some people want a napkin, some people won't. But pass those out, that'd be helpful. Or just pass the bag around and let people help themselves. I won't make it a big test. When I was asked to come and talk about puzzles, the only one that I could think of was one that my frightening Uncle Colin used to pose to us when we were very small. Uncle Colin was the head of the Greek department at McGill University, and I only knew him in the summertime when, as a sort of 6'2", 110-pound cadaverous man who never shaved, would curl up on a window seat and spend 3 months of the summer translating Greek as a way of relaxing his mind before the next year's teaching. I was thoroughly terrified of Uncle Colin. His puzzle for us was he smoked a lot, and so he's no longer with us, in part for that reason, but he would take these tins of tobacco and put rubber bands on the inside, suspending a penny on the inside of the rubber band. We could see that as children. And what would happen is if you roll this tin across the floor, the rubber band rolls up the penny, and the tin only goes so far, and then it comes rolling back. And he would never let us look inside the tin to know what it was. His other riddle was, why is a mouse when it spins? And he'd ask us this, and he'd sit there, and we'd notice an answer, and he'd look at us with these deep, sort of skull-like eyes, and he says, why is a mouse when it spins? He said, you're stupid, he'd say. The higher, the fewer. Everybody knows the answer to that. The higher, the fewer. I never understood it. I don't to this day. Now, while you're looking at your marshmallows, I'll tell you that when I was looking up some notes for this, I began reading about the marshmallow and realized to my embarrassment that the marshmallow is a plant that grows in the salt marshes of Egypt, and some 3,000 years ago, the marshmallow was born because they figured out that the sap of the marshmallow plant was a kind of mucilaginous stuff like aloe. And you could whip it and add a bit of honey to it and turn it into a candy and harden it in the sun. And the Egyptians used the marshmallow as a throat lozenge because it would sit in the throat. In later years, the Greeks, being a little bit more practical, used the sap from the marshmallow plant as a salve for wounds, not unlike aloe. And then the French took it back into the kitchen in the 19th century. They called it pâté de guimauve. Guimauve is French for marshmallow. And it was a real treat to confectioners, because they would take this sap and they'd whip it up and they'd add a bit of honey and they'd add some rose water, some flavoring, and they would bake it in a tray, and it was a tremendous amount of work. Then they discovered gelatin, and the marshmallow became a poor man's food, because gelatin and egg whites could be easily whipped up and added to sugar, and everybody would get there. So there was a big breakthrough in the 1940s in the US when a fellow by the name of Alex Dumac invented the extrusion process. Prior to that, marshmallows had to be baked like brownies in a tray. He figured out this system of pipes. And so he'd thrash up the marshmallow with the gelatin, get it to just the right consistency, and then it would come shooting out these pipes where a knife would chop it like this. And that was the birth of the marshmallow shape that we know it as today. In fact, the Dumac Company, if you happen to be holding or have one of those bags on your table, you'll know it's still in Elk Grove Village in Bensonville, Illinois, the home of the original American Marshmallow Company. The extrusion was patented in, I think, the late 40s, early 50s, and now we are said to consume some 90 million pounds of marshmallows a year. My father had a tremendous capacity for marshmallows. I remember as a small child to go camping, and he would sit rather like an overlord near the fire and command that we sharpen sticks and toast marshmallows on the fire. And the test was to get it just right, get it golden brown. If it caught fire, we were failures. But if we could get it golden brown and present it to him, like some kind of emperor, he would look at it and take it off the stick and eat it and give us approval as children. This mattered a lot to us. And it was actually considerably good for him because he had 6 kids, so he got a lot of marshmallows. So anyway, the marshmallow that you have on the table in front of you is actually part of a very key experiment in behavioral science that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. For your purposes now, all I'll say is, if you want to eat it, eat it. Just enjoy it. If you want to wait, I have more marshmallows in the bag here. And if you present your marshmallow to me at the end of my speech, I'll give you another marshmallow. So that's your choice. You can either eat the one that you have now or wait and have another one. No judgment here at all. When you're thinking about that. I'm going to tell you about a radio assignment that I see hands over faces. A few years ago, I was sent to the Orkney Islands on assignment. The Orkney Islands are a pretty desolate part of the planet, a string of islands north of Scotland. You have to drive to the very north of Scotland and take a ferry to these islands where it's almost too far north to grow trees. There are big rock cliffs and heather and tundra and a lot of rain and a lot of clouds. And I was going there actually on some kind of a family genealogy trip where Orcadian descendants from Minnesota and North Dakota and the province of Manitoba in Canada were in search of their relatives. And I'll explain to you why they were doing that. And I'll do that by telling you there's a city on the west side of the Orkney Islands called Stromness. And it's about 1,500 people. It's not a particularly attractive village, a bunch of small houses down by a fairly well-sheltered harbor. Back in the 1600s, just a handful of houses there, but it was a very important place at that time because what Stromness had was fresh water. And when the ships were making their original trips to North America, to the New World, they knew even back then that the shortest route was to go as far north as you possibly could, like the jets do today, to go as far north as you could and come back down by Greenland and Iceland. And the last piece of dry land, not very dry, but the last piece of land that they could top up their water tanks was the Orkney Islands. And so it became kind of a popular place. Captain Cook got his water there, Sir John Franklin got his water there before he disappeared in the Northwest Passage. And the Company of Adventurers, the Hudson Bay Company, was using it as well. And this was a time when the fur trade was flourishing, was at a real peak. hundreds of boatloads of beaver pelts being brought back from all over North America to the hat makers in Europe, where the beaver pelt was felted and made into hats. And the Company of Adventurers, the Hudson Bay Company, that's what I'll call it from now on, would provision their ships in London and stack those ships in London and go up the west coast of the British Isles, pick up their fresh water and head over there. But they had a problem. The problem was that the kids they hired on the London docks to be their factors, that was the mercantile agents they would take overseas, were city kids. And what they were doing is they'd take these kids and they would plant them in a rock shelter on the shore of Hudson Bay or on some godforsaken riverbank in northern Minnesota and say, stay there for 3 or 4 years. Gather the beaver pelts, put them in canoes, send them to the places where we can bring the ships. And after that time, we'll pay you and we'll bring you back. Well, the city kids had no interest in this at all. They'd seen the lights of the big city. They knew they had pubs, they had girls around them, they had access to whatever a city had in the 17th and 18th century. So the Hudson Bay Company had a real problem. They would take their factories overseas, and after 6 months or a year, they'd abandon their post or they'd demand to be brought back. And some commercial genius with the Hudson Bay Company figured out that they could actually get the young men from the Orkney Islands, pick up the fresh water and pick up the young men at the same time and hire them as factors to work in Rupert's Land, as it was then called, the New World, the most northern and uninhabited, certainly by European, part of the world that was known at that time. And these Orcadian kids thought it was great, because they're basically leaving the same climate and circumstances that they were living in the Orkney Islands, moving to the shore of Hudson Bay or the Red River, and they were going to be paid. And they'd get to come back in 4 years with enough money that would give them the opportunity to move beyond Dad's fishing boat or the scratchy little farm that they had. As a matter of fact, the Hudson Bay Company got so taken by the willingness of the young Orcadian boys that they actually built a school in Stromness in the 1700s to teach them how to add and how to write so they could be better mercantile agents, because they weren't even learning that. So the reason I'm telling you the story is that I remember thinking about that at the time when I was in New York, and I have never stopped thinking about it, because it's the closest I ever came to a sense of time that we no longer think about today. Imagine making that commitment today, that you're going to leave your family for 3 to 5 years, and you're not going to see them. It's not quite like going to Duke. You know? They didn't get to go home. They had no form of communication. They didn't have Skype or internet. They didn't have telegrams. This was 200 years before the British invented the postal system. So the only way these kids from the Orkney Islands could communicate with their families, who were probably illiterate anyway, was to scribble out a note and give it to one of the ship captains, who wasn't going back to the Orkney Islands, was going back to London to reprovision the ship. And if that note made it from London back up to Loggins-Well and Stromness as the ship was leaving, maybe there'd be some communication. Now, technology has a ton to do with this. There weren't airplanes. There's no way of moving around the world the way that we're used to doing it today. But I know it's happening here in the U.S. as well. Kids in the latter stages of the whaling industry would get on the ships in Nantucket. And this is after all the whales had been fished out of the Atlantic Ocean. And they would sail for months to the western side of the Pacific Oceans in search of whales. And they wouldn't come back for 3 or 4 years. And I think of those kids in context of what I want to talk about today, because I think the theme of your day is puzzles. And the puzzle I've chosen to talk about is time, and how the collapsing and changing of time is changing the way that we live our lives. Now, I'm going to go back to your marshmallows for a minute here. I'm assuming that some of you, because I saw a couple of wise nods, have heard of the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. And for those who haven't, a quick recap. I hadn't heard about it. I had to look it up. But back in the late 60s, there was a psychologist by the name of Waldo at Stanford. And he had two daughters who were at a nursery school that was attached to the university, the nursery school. And it wasn't an entirely ordinary nursery school because there were one-way mirrors in some of the rooms because the students of behavioral science would sit and watch the children play as a way of learning what they had to learn. And there were a couple of rooms that they could direct play and see how the children would respond. And so Walter, because his kids were there, and he had to go and pick them up, got this idea for an experiment. He's a psychologist, and he wanted to test something called deferred gratification. And so he'd take kids who were 4 and 5 years old, bring them alone into a room, place a marshmallow on the table in front of them, and just like I said to you, the adult who brought the marshmallow in would say, "That marshmallow is for you. You can eat it now if you want. But if you wait until I come back in about 15 minutes, I'll give you another marshmallow." Is that clear? Is that understood? There'd be nods all around, and the person would leave the room. Now, think of this as something for a 4-year-old. Think of this, I like the description of it as the infantile trinity, need, want, now. Anyone who's spent time with a 4-year-old knows that they have no concept of time. You can't tell, I learned the hard way, you can't tell your 4-year-old daughter that you're going on a really exciting trip in a week because you're going to be pestered about it about every half hour. Is a week up? Are we there yet? Can we leave now? There's a motivational speaker called Joaquin Posada who said that the equivalent for us is like me saying, "Can I get you a cup of coffee?" You know, and I say, "I'll be back in 3 hours." So the experiment has been reproduced a couple of times, and rather than describe what the kids do, I'm going to get Chris to show us what they do.
Okay, sit in the chair. Alright, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so they know how to. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? Alright. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back. It's yummy, yummy. Oh, it smells really good. It's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
visuals expressed the distinction between instant and deferred gratification in a physical way that actually goes on in our heads, but they don't have the social tools to disguise that, which is why the video itself is so amusing. And it was a chance for the psychologist to get a little bit closer to the impact of deferred gratification, if the kids understood it, which they did, how they understood it, and most of them did, and how it affected them. The results of the initial test, only 1/3 of the kids made it the full 15 minutes. 2/3 of them ate the marshmallow. But I like watching it because of the visual expression of what is the inner fight that we live with and the choices that we make about all the things that we want to do or we don't want to do. There's a guy called Jonathan Haidt who wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, and he describes the battle between the emotions and the rational side of it as a battle between the elephant and the elephant's rider, which is a terrific metaphor because when they disagree, the elephant wins, right? The rider cannot control the elephant when the emotion, the elephant, decides to take over. So if you want to get up, but you're going to sleep in, it's the elephant saying, sleep in. If you need to study, and it's the elephant saying, let's go to the party, right, then the elephant will often win. The elephant will say, eat the marshmallow, and eventually you're going to eat the marshmallow. The elephant, in terms of time, thinks short-term, instant gratification. The rider thinks long-term, and the consequences, and what's next, and am I going to get a second marshmallow if I don't eat the first one? The point that Haidt makes, though, is that the elephant is essential. The elephant is a force for good. The elephant is love. The elephant is loyalty. The elephant is sympathy. The elephant is all these emotions that we have to function in the world. So it's not something that necessarily needs to be restrained. He writes about our ability or our inability to control those emotions. Now, the link to time that I want to make between instant and deferred gratification is also keyed in with the fact that we have a finite period of time within which we have to make those decisions. The kids have 15 minutes, and you get to see their resolve disintegrating over that period of time. But in truth, you know, if you're walking past your roommate's desk and there's a piece of a chocolate bar on there, you have that much time to decide if you're going to pick up the chocolate bar and eat it, right? You are in the middle of something and a call comes in, and you have how much time to decide if you're going to take that call, right? These are decisions that have implications, but because of, you know, in many ways, the myriad of things that we're trying to accomplish at the same time, we have less time within which we have to make that decision. For me, it was like, you know, I'm going to study, I'm not going to study, and then it occurred to me that I'd be talking to the University Scholars Program. Probably is not your problem. You end up studying, but it was a big difficulty for me. So as we get a little closer to the distinction between instant and deferred gratification, the question, one of the puzzles is, so do we sacrifice the quality of the decision? Do we make a bad decision when we're caught between making that choice in a narrowing window of time? And it has longer ramifications, or different ramifications, which I'll get to in a minute, which is the difference between long-term goals and short-term goals. Can you be a long-term planner if you reach for instant gratification, or do you live a life that's based more on short-term planning and short-term goals? I know this because I work in radio, and so I am, in so many ways, a complete prisoner of time. Every weekday we have to do a program that runs an hour long. Every weekday it goes to air at 1 in the afternoon, and we don't get to miss that deadline. We absolutely don't. And we have to prepare a promo for the program that is 24 seconds long, a billboard that is 58 seconds long, which is followed by a 5-minute NPR newscast, and then a 29-second window for underwriting. And our program is chopped up into 3 sections, which every day are 12 minutes and 29 seconds long, 18 minutes and 29 seconds long, and the third is 18 minutes and 59 seconds long. It's my job and the directors to make sure that whatever interviews or stories we choose to tell fall exactly within those windows, because we sell the program to stations all over the country, and they have the expectations that we are going to be precisely within those windows. So their computer can take the program off the net, load it onto their computer, and fire it and run it. Nobody has to touch it. The total running time of what I do each day is 50 minutes and 57 seconds long. Now, I kind of embrace that. You know, I say I'm a prisoner of it, but I embrace it because it allows me to plan my day around exactly what it is that I have to accomplish. And I'll go a little bit further and tell you, well, we're chopping up time in bits and pieces, that I'm 55 years old and I've been in radio for 35 years. When I started, I was working in the Canadian Arctic, which is maybe why I have an affection for those Orcadian kids on the shore of Hudson Bay. And I won't bore you with stories of northern hardship, but I will tell you that in 1977, when I started working as a news reporter, and I had to send a news report from Churchill, Manitoba, or from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories to my main news office in Toronto, I had to use a Telex machine. It was the only way that we could transmit copies at that time. 1977 is before the fax was in widespread use. And in point of fact, the fax wasn't much use because it only made one copy, and my news would need many copies. And so I would type it out on a Telex machine, making a small strip of paper tape through a puncher, on a little punch on the side. So a long news story would be about 7 feet of tape. And I finish and I tear it off and I put it into the reader and click the little shutter closed, and then I dial up Toronto and the connection would be made, and I press send. And I'd, like a player piano, watch this piece of tape being sucked into the machine while the little pieces of metal read the punch holes that I made. And my news story was appearing as typed copy 2,000 miles away. And in 1977, I thought that was magic. I thought that was just the coolest thing. And I don't want to dwell too much on that, except to say that we're a long way past that now. I still have young producers in my newsroom who say to me, "So, how did you do this before the internet anyway?" And I mean, it's a legitimate question. That's how much my industry has changed, right? The way that satellites and sat phones and the internet and all the speeds with which we can gather and transmit the news. I mean, and I love all this. I think it makes us better informed. I think it makes us faster. The volume of the information that's at my fingertips dazzles me every single day. I had to write a story this past week about some guy kayaking around Ellesmere Island, which is way up by Greenland, and I thought, damn, I knew because someone had given me a piece of paper that it was the 10th largest island in the world, but what does that mean? It meant nothing to me. So, Google square miles, Ellesmere Island, 75,000 square miles. It's big, okay? And I go, US states, square miles, the list. I go, Nebraska, 76,000. This island the size of Nebraska, right? Sounding very wise. It would have taken me an hour and a half to look that up if I wanted to make that comparison before. And so, I mean, I take tremendous delight in that. I used to work as a wildlife reporter on the west coast of British Columbia when I was publishing fishing stories. And so we were comparing the spawning times and patterns of the coho and the spring salmon and the pinks and the kings, that I was forever on the phone with fisheries people saying, now what's the distinction, what's the season, and what's the... It's just, I mean, it's all there now. You can have it anytime you want. So that's good, but, I mean, and I'll talk a little bit about something that you've heard before, so bear with me, but the biggest shift that I saw in our industry, the biggest collapse in time, happened around 1990. At that point, CNN had been on the air for 10 years, and you've probably heard or read about the CNN effect, and it's a very real thing. And when people talk about the CNN effect, invariably what they're talking about is what it was like to have live reports from a war zone, what it was like to have Peter Arnett and other people describing the arrival of cruise missiles outside their hotel door in Baghdad in the first Gulf War. But the CNN effect, in fact, was much more significant before that, because what happened in the run-up to the first Gulf War, quickly Saddam Hussein wanted more Kuwait's oil, sent his army into Kuwait in order to grab that. And that led to several months of protracted back and forth. There were hostages taken and diplomacy and so on and so forth. But that was the very first time when 24-hour cable television was a big part of that diplomacy. Saddam Hussein was interviewed regularly on CNN, and he would be interviewed at such and such a time in Baghdad. And so there were people at the State Department who were staying up at midnight to watch that interview, make decisions based on what he was saying. I mean, at the time, George Herbert Walker Bush was the president. The Secretary of State was James Baker. Defense Secretary was Dick Cheney. You had Saddam Hussein. Tariq Aziz was his foreign secretary. You had all these other countries, Saudi Arabia, Britain. They were all in the mix. This was the makings for real diplomacy, an opportunity to, test sanctions, to have long conversations, to let wise diplomats try and sort stuff out. None of that happened in 1990. I remember distinctly the reports that came out some months after the Iraqis moved into Kuwait, that the Iraqi soldiers had gone into the maternity ward of Kuwait Royal Hospital and dumped infant children out of the incubators onto the floor of the neonatal ward. And we were all horrified at this. And that in many ways turned public opinion in favor of the start of the first Gulf War. The problem was it wasn't true. It was raised, it was questioned at the time, it was proved to be untrue later on. And forgive me a parallel, but I mean, reports of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2003 are what led to public support for that war, and that was proved not to be true as well. So the speed that we take such delight in gathering and transmitting news and turning that into public opinion and making public policy based on that public opinion and making political decisions based on that has a downside as well. In that first Gulf War, my post was in a hotel in Amman, Jordan. My job every morning for weeks on end was to sit by a small shortwave radio with my Arabic translator. We would transcribe the morning news from Radio Baghdad, and then we would run that past experts and try to make sense out of what the Iraqis were doing. And it was unbelievably lame. I mean, at the same time, CNN was broadcasting its satellite reports from the Al Rashid Hotel in Baghdad. And I was still covering the war like it was a World War II correspondent. I mean, I might as well have had a uniform on. I so envied the power that CNN had at the time. I craved that kind of access, and it's only now when we look at that in kind of a rear-view mirror do we get a chance to see how damaging that can be. I want to go back to your marshmallows for just a moment here and jump ahead about 11, 12, 13 years. Because Walter Mitchell was sitting around the kitchen table with the kids one day, and he said, so whatever happened to Susie anyway? And Bill, that kid that you were in nursery school with, tell me about him. And it was the starting point for a conversation about realizing that they had this database of how these kids had behaved with instant deferred gratification at the age of 4 and 5 that they could now test when those kids were finishing high school. And so they did that. They distributed a questionnaire, and they found out, and this wasn't a setup, but for those of you who've eaten your marshmallow, but they found out that those who ate the marshmallow had more trouble in school. They had a higher percentage of behavioral problems. Their SAT scores were, on average, 200 points lower than the people who had resisted eating the marshmallow. And suddenly they thought to themselves, we've got something here that we can work with. We can actually take this on into a study of the brain, and they did that. But the whole idea that the behavior of a 4-year-old was going to be a predictor of that person as a young adult gave them access to a body, because there were hundreds of kids who went through the Marshmallow Experiment, a way of studying instant versus deferred gratification. I suspect if you ran the test with 4-year-olds today, you might find that more of them ate the marshmallow. I'm purely guessing that, but if you look at how anxious and eager kids are to move from one task to another, our expectation of instant gratification in the world that we live in. I know my own appetite for instant gratification embarrasses me at times. I try to load a website, it takes 10 seconds, and I get all fidgety. It's like, be there, I need this information. I think, and it's coming to me in a fraction of the time it would have taken me to open a book. that is on the shelf. But still, I had things to do, places that, things to write and stuff like that. If I go to the ATM, I want my money now. If there's a problem at the ATM, I'm angry with that. I go, if I want food at a grocery store, when I was a kid, the grocery stores were closed on Sunday. Now they're open 24 hours a day. I want to get Krista to kind of underline this with a commercial I think we're probably all familiar with. It's an AT&T commercial.
This new AT&T 4G LTE is fast.
Did you hear Sam got promoted to director? So 12 seconds ago.
We should get him a present.
Thanks for the gift basket.
You're welcome.
You see HR just sent out new
Office rules? Because you're currently in violation with 6 of them.
Oh yeah, baby?
And 7.
You guys hear the Fred's leaving?
So 30 seconds ago.
We'll miss you! Oh, thanks, Kate!
I love the cake.
The new HTC Pivot. Stay a step ahead with AT&T 4G LTE with speeds up to 10 times faster than 3G.
What are they saying? They are saying that speed is good, but they're also saying that there's no real limit to that, right? The faster, the better. The easier access to information, the quicker you're going to be making decisions, the better off you are, without really any consideration of what it would take to pause, right? That to me is the kind of puzzle that fascinates me. I live with it on a daily basis in my business, looking at how the overuse of that speed gets us into difficulty. But I think that the parallel between the kids who are using Marshmallow or not, or the people who want to download the website in a heartbeat or not, it is in many ways an indication of what's going on. And I want to thank Greg Smith of Goldman Sachs for resigning from his position this week in a much noted op-ed in the New York Times. I'm not sure if you saw it, but he wrote, and I'll quote him here, "These days, the most common question I get from junior analysts about derivatives is, how much money do we make off a client? It bothers me every time I hear it because it's a clear reflection of what they're observing from their leaders about the way they should behave." When I was a first-year analyst, said Greg, I didn't know where the bathroom was or how to tie my shoelaces. I was taught to be concerned with learning the ropes, finding out what a derivative was, understanding finance, getting to know our clients and what motivated them, learning how they define success and what we could do to help get them there. And he finishes by saying, "My proudest moments in life, getting a full scholarship to go from South Africa to Stanford University, being selected as a Rhodes Scholar National Finalist, winning a bronze medal for table tennis at the Maccabi Games in Israel, known as the Jewish Olympics, these have all come through hard work with no shortcuts. Goldman Sachs today has become too much about shortcuts and not enough about achievements." It doesn't feel right to me anymore. And I thought it was kind of cool that there was another quote that I pulled much earlier. This is actually Ralph Waldo Emerson in the late 1800s, and he says, "I hate this shallow Americanism which hopes to get rich by credit, to get knowledge by raps on midnight tables, to learn the economy of the mind by phrenology, or skill without study, or mastery without apprenticeship." And I'm a part of the generation that got us into the mess that we are now. This whole economic thing that Greg Smith is talking about was, I don't want to wait until my house is paid for. I can get money from my house now. I can get a second and a third mortgage. I mean, it was the housing crisis that led us to the mess that we're in. That's making it difficult for you to contemplate the kind of work that you're going to have when you graduate, in part because we wanted it all so quickly. We wanted the instant gratification, I mean, you want the doodad from Amazon, and you want it in 3 days, then it's not going to come from an American factory, right? That's just the way it works. So your decision there, your desire for that kind of gratification, it has consequences that are beyond you. I have to help choose the guests that we put on the story. And we try to create a distinct identity for the program. If we don't, people won't buy it. It's just another interview program. And so we emphasize the story. We emphasize the narrative. We have to have an engaging narrative. And to have an engaging narrative, you have to have experience and commitment and passion. These are all things that make for a story. You can talk to somebody about their surprise lottery win on the day that they win the money, and it's kind of a short story. but if you talk to that person about how they lost all their friends or their life was turned upside down 5 or 10 years after they won that money, it's a much more interesting story. So that's what I mean by experience and time. I did an interview recently with a fellow, a biologist by the name of John Priscu, and he's, I think, in Montana, no, Wyoming, I forget. But he's the lead American scientist on the aim to connect with the subglacial lakes in Antarctica. Do you remember the story about, I think, 3 weeks ago when the Russians punctured through 2 miles of ice for the very first time to get to these subglacial lakes that they had known for years were there because they could see them from radar, but they didn't have the equipment or the window in time long enough to do the drilling in Antarctica. And at the very end of the Antarctic summer, the Russians punched through into one of these lakes, and they immediately plugged the hole, in part because they wanted to do everything they could to avoid contaminating the water before they studied the biology of it. And they have to wait now until next summer. A couple of days after they got through, I called John Priscu about this. We put him on the radio. And, I mean, he was like one of the 4-year-olds who'd eaten a marshmallow. He was just beside himself, so excited, and explained to me that he'd spent 40 years of his professional career waiting to find out, studying the ice cores, waiting for this information, and to hear the passion in his voice talk about why it mattered so much to him to have access to that knowledge made me think what a contrast that is to that whole sense of instant versus deferred gratification. That poor sucker deferred his gratification for 40 years. Think about that. Now, I did another interview not long ago with Keanis, a fellow who is an artist in residence at Bates College. Frank Glazier is celebrated last month his 97th birthday. He's still an artist in residence. He's still performing. He is proud to talk about the times that he performed in Carnegie Hall. The guy's a serious player. And he's now been playing the piano for 90 years, which was a wonderful opportunity for me to ask him, what do you learn after 90 years of playing the piano?
People say, why don't you retire? Well, it would be ridiculous for me. All my life, I worked to be able to like what I hear when I play. Now I hear it. So why should I quit now? Well, when I'm finally hearing what I've always wanted to hear, but didn't always hear, you see. And secondly, the audience gets it, the musical message that I discover in the music, in the essence of the character and spirit of the music. Now that I've learned how to understand it and bring it to people who really tell me wonderful things about it in very unusual terms.
You're telling me that you're better now than you've ever been as a pianist.
That is true. I'm still getting better. Because I've learned, for one thing, I've learned how to learn a piece, how to let it talk to me, how to let it speak so that I finally get it. And technically, my technique is as good as it's ever been. It hasn't suffered.
So listening to Frank reminds me of the kids in the Orkney Islands who went and spent 5 years doing what they did on that. Because I think to myself, I care about his story. I'm interested in knowing what I have to learn from him because of what he's got invested in that. Just like I'm interested in hearing from that 17th century kid who's come back after 5 years isolation on the banks of the Red River somewhere. I'm going to make one more note about Walter Mischel and his Marshmallow Experiment because it was written up recently in the New Yorker. It's kind of an interesting coda. The kids who were 4 or 5 are now adults in their mid-30s, and the data continues to underline the distinction between those who go for instant and those who defer their gratification. The people who ate marshmallow were more inclined to put on weight, more inclined to have trouble with their relationships. But the more interesting thing now is that they have the technology, and I have to defer to, I'm sure people in this room can tell me more about it than I'll ever know. They now have the technology to examine the part of the brain where those choices are made, the prefrontal cortex. They have this thing called transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they can read the brain as it struggles with the same decisions that we're watching those kids express at the age of 4. And it's a way of learning something about the instincts that we have and our ability or our inability to control those instincts. And again, I bring it back to the narrowing window of time within which you have to make those decisions, and you know, the long-term implications or the morals and the ethics of making that decision. There's a series of schools across the country. I'm sure you've heard of the KIPP schools, Knowledge is Power program, KIPP. And I noted in the paper not long ago that there's a KIPP school in Philadelphia that knows a little bit about the Stanford experiment, and the kids wear a T-shirt that says, "Don't eat the marshmallow." So the puzzle that intrigues me is, in a way, how to resist the temptation of instant gratification, how to restrain desire, how to find some reason at a speed that is ever increasing for us, and how we kind of separate the delight that we can and should take in the instant access to information. And I couldn't live with that you couldn't live with that as students, to separate that from the kinds of decisions that have greater consequences based on that. One of your professors, Kathy Davison, wrote a book called Now You See It, where she talks about, if she was here, she'd probably be wagging her finger at me, because she embraces the sort of multitasking brain, the speed, and how we operate within the world that is changing. And I don't dispute that. I'm not arguing against that. I'm just trying to find and express it in the way of a puzzle to you, the distinction between being able to operate at that speed and understanding the consequences of operating at that speed. I'll close with one little fact. Alex Dumac, the guy who invented the extrusion that made the marshmallows, started working on the process in 1921 and patented it in 1950. So it took him 29 years to figure out how to get all the air into the marshmallow glue and get it coming out of the extrusion and get them chopped and cooked and packaged as campfire marshmallows. So thank you for your time, and if you didn't eat your marshmallow, I have more up here. Now you just get to stuff each other. Any questions? Anything that you want to talk about? Yeah.
So my question is, how do you know what values drive what you're willing to wait for and what you're not willing to wait for? I'm a marshmallow eater, but I'm willing to wait 12 yogurts to make 12 hours to make my own yogurt. So what is it that drives our values of what we're willing to wait for and what we're not willing to wait for?
So I answered the question. The only intelligent answer that I have for that, not being a psychologist or a behavioral scientist, are the kinds of decisions that we have to make every day as journalists, and that is, trying to weigh the merits against the seduction of speed. I could, if I found out the name of the Army sergeant who killed all the civilians in Afghanistan, I would have a scoop that would give me notoriety as a journalist around the world. And if I put that information on the radio before his family was taken out of his house in Washington, sequestered on an army base, then who really benefits from that? That's where, Jon Stewart makes tremendous fun of the way CNN covers the primaries with the countdowns to we're about to get the results from. And I see in that the same kind of absurdity. We end up just so unbelievably captivated with our ability to do something that we don't even think about the value of what we're doing. It's a great example when the New York Times correspondent David Rode was taken hostage by the Taliban. And I think it was Bill Keller was the executive editor at the time. So he had to call, correct me if I get the name wrong, Jimmy Swales, is that the guy who's in charge of Wikipedia? I think it is. Wales, thanks. And say, look, we think that if, we're pretty sure you're going to find out quickly the data that's been taken captive by the Taliban. And we're reliably informed that if the information becomes public, his life is going to be at greater risk. And you sit on that information. And in a kind of marvel of cooperation, which doesn't happen very often in my business, everybody agreed not to say anything about the fact that Rode and his Iraqi translator were being held captive. The information was kept off the air, and he was able to escape as a result of that. So, I mean, unfortunately, the measure by which we judge the value of acting quickly is not the measure that marks the morality of the choice. But that doesn't much matter in my business. I'm talking to you now about a kind of principle that I think would be a good thing. But I mean, gosh, if I was operating a 24-hour news network and trying to compete against the other 24-hour news network, I'd probably be just as craven and eager to get the name of that Army sergeant on the air before anyone else. We'll find out in the next week or so how it was the U.S. military was able to protect his name, who knew about it, why it wasn't released. It would be an interesting story because it's just one of those details of the business where as soon as you know that it's an American soldier, then you know there's his hometown, and you know there's a family, you know there's probably kids who are in the school, and you've got local television trucks with the satellite dishes that just want to be parked outside, and they're there right now. The family's off the house, but they're in the neighborhood interviewing everyone who ever had anything to do with that family. So I give you the answer from a perspective of journalism. I'm not much good with elephants and riders and marshmallows. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned Greg Smith's editorial, and it's been the #1 emailed article on New York Times all week until today. So obviously a lot of people have read it. Have you ever read Liar's Poker?
Yes.
It's interesting because some of the things that Smith talks about in that editorial, like
this is Lewis's book, right, Michael Lewis?
Yeah, Michael Lewis's. I think probably the book that made it famous, really. He worked at Salomon Brothers in the early '80s, so some of the things that Smith mentions in his editorial about talking about clients, we're going to rip their eyeballs off or tear their faces off, that kind of thing, meaning we're going to make an enormous amount of money off this guy because he's too stupid to know that what we're selling him is garbage. Lewis talks about that as being rampant in the culture of Salomon Brothers in the 1980s. Even if you look back to the 1920s, the stock market crash was fueled by rampant stock speculation and buying on a lot of margin, essentially borrowing money to speculate on stocks. And I wonder, we went through a period where that wasn't so true, probably from the 1940s through the 1970s up to the early 1970s. And I wonder if you think that these, sort of the patience or whatever you want to call it, instant gratification versus delayed gratification, as a societal phenomenon, if you feel that might sort of be cyclical. That sometimes people sort of overcompensate. People saw the 1950s and the early 1960s as being too sort of chastened, and then there's this overreaction to that. And now, we have what happened in 2008, and maybe our generation is like pulling back from that. And I've been thinking about this a lot, whether this moves in cycles.
That's a good question. I think that one of the things to look at over that same period of time that you're describing is the shift from pensions to self-directed retirement, because most people who are in the working world actually control their own money through a 401k or an IRA or whatever, which means that people with no knowledge are participating in the stock market, and maybe they got lucky and bought Apple 2 years ago, or maybe they got really unlucky and had all their money in the market prior to the crash in the fall of 2008. But the reason 1920 is a reflection of 2008 is because a whole lot of uninformed people were participating in the market. It's what drew people into the market in the dot-com explosion, 1998, 1999. Everybody thought they could make money. Right? The interesting twist is now that everybody is kind of being told that this is their opportunity to make money. If you can't turn, the money that you're setting aside for your own retirement into something that you can survive on, you've got problems. So you got a whole bunch of people who are holding down jobs as teachers or physicists or truck drivers who are trying to manage their retirement in the market. They shouldn't be there. They're the people who are getting their eyeballs ripped out, right? And that's in part why the market functions the way it does, because there's always going to be someone who loses money for someone else to make money, right? And so, I like the counter that came to the Greg Smith op-ed from the financial sector, which was, wait a second, when we're successful, our clients are successful. I think that's questionable. I think it's an interesting defense. But I'm not entirely sure that's correct. You look at the bonuses that were being paid out in 2009 and 2010. It makes you wonder whether or not they really are concerned about the welfare of the clients. But I mean, it's what it does is it forces ordinary people to make uninformed decisions with their money, and they feel like every single one of those decisions has. Well, wait a second. Every single one of those decisions does have consequences, and they live with the pressure of those consequences. How am I going to manage my retirement? Because I have to manage my retirement. I don't have a public pension fund, or I don't have a company pension fund. If I was an auto worker in Detroit in 1963, I didn't have a care in the world. I had a guaranteed job, I had a guaranteed pension, I had medical. It's all gone, right? It's an interesting point you raise about where we go from here. So I was listening to something on the radio just a couple of days ago saying that, the markets are on a climb, they're on a bit of a tear, and guess what? People aren't getting back in. People are feeling too burned. They don't want to be there. I think it's an interesting prism through which to look at, the consequences of decisions that people have to make, because they have to do that without the tools to make those decisions.
I was thinking about...
Can you speak up?
Sure. You talk a lot about collapsing time in storytelling and broadcast and the work that you do. And I was thinking also about how radio manages to collapse space. And thinking about that T-Mobile commercial. AT&T, sorry.
They're all the same.
There's a way in which it suggests that there's no longer a sort of, that we don't live immediately any longer.
Right.
There's no longer an immediacy to our existence because it's all mediated and we just talk about what's happened, but we have no sense of what it was like to experience what has happened. And the thing about radio is, in your position, whether you're doing an interview with someone with a phone or in person, the way that we as listeners experience it still fills our space with sound. Your voices still become this very immediate thing, and really collapse these great distances. And I was thinking about the history of radio versus, say, cinema. And I know that radio has changed a lot, and there's still podcasts, and there are millions of different ways that we experience radio broadcasts. But in a sense, there's still that same impulse that you just turn on a device and listen. And so I don't know, you've been in radio a long time, but I was thinking about sort of...
Yeah, I've worked in television. I did came back to radio. And I think about this too, because there is no good explanation for the survival of radio. It really should be off the air. I mean, there's just no intelligent explanation for the survival of the media, which in many ways hasn't changed in 75 years, right? My theory is that it's one of the few that allows you to function while it's on. You can't really make breakfast if you want to watch the television, the morning television news. You can't watch the toast and the egg and the coffee if you're watching television. It's a bit too much. You all of them poorly as a result of that. But radio's been around long enough that we've all learned to make it, to find that part of our brain that allows enough of the radio in to be an interesting part of our stimulation without being overwhelming. Television is something where the listening or the viewing has to be very passive, and the listening to radio is a very active thing. The other thing that works about radio, which I think the net's starting to get to, but is not there yet, and television has failed dismally at, is intimacy. We generally watch television from a distance of about 7 or 8 feet, close to that pillar, perhaps even to the next pillar, 12, 13 feet. Right? And that establishes, in a way, the nature of the interaction, if there's any interaction at all. But when I'm talking on the radio, I'm about this close, right? That's as far away the speaker in your car is, right? And I'm even closer than that in a bedside radio or in a radio on the kitchen counter. So I don't have to shout at you. Radio does a lot of shouting, and it can be very effective. Rush. The success of it is, I think, in its intimacy and the fact that it can create a connection between the listener and the program that other media have yet to quite reach. I mean, we were talking about this the other day, trying to measure the success of the Coney 2012 thing. Why will people spend half an hour watching that video? And part of the reason is that it's a family story, right? It's actually not about Joseph Coney. It's about a father trying to teach his son something. That's what keeps you there. You know, the Coney is kind of like the medicine that you have to take with the sweet part of the story. The sweet part of the story is his father puzzling, how he's going to educate his child to make his way in the world. I don't want to get into a conversation on the video and the rightness and wrong, but that's the net trying to use that same level of personal stuff that goes beyond funny pet tricks to draw you in. Hi. Yes.
So my question is related to how do you pick some of the stories that go from your program? Because you spoke earlier about collapsing time. You are a slave to time because you've got this very stringent schedule to abide by. But at the same time, the notion of some of the storylines you have are very personal. They're moving narratives, and in that way they're timeless. So how do you negotiate this sort of balance between like having something that's time sensitive because it is radio, it is news in some way, with something that is a moving like human portrait or something that's affectionate sensitive?
So because what you get on the radio is my voice and the guest's voice. I'm a character on the radio, and my task is to make the guest a character on the radio. So if I'm talking with a woman in Colin about how her world is changing, I'm going to try and find ways of getting her to express that in terms that are immediately accessible to any one of us here, where I say to her, if you're driving from your home to work each day, is that dangerous? Do you have to go through checkpoints? All of a sudden we're like, oh yeah, I drive. I know what that's like. And we often talk about the power of radio as a relational thing. Oftentimes I'll be having a conversation with someone and you're saying, how well you did on the swim team and how much it meant to you and what you were thinking of now that you were close to qualifying for the London Olympics. And then I'll pause and I'll say, who got you into swimming? You say, oh, my mother. I said, so what does it mean to your mother that you're doing that well? Boom, right? Then I had you. I had your emotion because I'm getting you to talk about something that really matters to you. You're not just expressing the I, but you're expressing where you fit in your world. And then you speak about that with a kind of passion and commitment which might not have been there before that. So I guess what I'm saying is, I mean, we struggle a little bit with this because we are a pre-recorded program. It means we get to shape the material we do, but it causes us problems at the same time. If we want to do a program, as we're doing this coming Monday, about what's going on in Afghanistan, then we package it on Friday, and we send it up to the Net Content Depot, which is where it all lives until it's broadcast. But we're going to have to go in early on Monday and tweak a couple of things, because the name of the sergeant is out and a few other things have changed. And so if I was live, that wouldn't be a problem, which means I have to trade off some of that immediacy, and the trade-off for that is to look for what I believe is personal in someone's story, because I think that the excitement of the scientist who's waited for 40 years for this thing to happen is something that we can all vicariously take pleasure in, right? But I need to get to a point where he's not just telling me about it, you're hearing it in his voice. I mean, there's a woman, a British broadcaster, who's written a book called The Human Voice, and one of the ways she tries to underline that is she says, go into a room, this would be as good as any, and play the sound of a baby crying, and watch how people respond to that, men and women, you know. But she said it's so unbelievably visceral that it's in fact the same connection that's created when I'm talking on the radio or you're talking on the radio. If you take all the visuals out of it, the only way I know you or you know me is through the sound of your voice. Then we're particularly good at judging emotion if we hear it. You know, you're sitting on the bus and there's a conversation behind you and it's two guys arguing. You know the expression on their face. You don't have to turn around to look at them, right? Because we're just so good at intuiting the emotion and the passion in what they're saying, because the human voice is so powerful. Which brings us back again to one of the things that's kept radio functioning on the air.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.